Hey, it's Max from UNFTR reporting for the MeidasTouch network. When it comes to reporting on economic data, there's really one metric that matters above all others: jobs. And when it comes to jobs, we're being asked to hold several thoughts in our minds at once.
2025, now the weakest year of jobs growth since the pandemic. Now, on the other hand, the unemployment rate dipped to 4.4%.
Worst job growth year since the pandemic. If memory serves, that was a pretty bad year. But the unemployment rate actually dipped, and it's holding steady at acceptable levels to this administration. With 2025 in the rear view, level setting on the U.S. employment picture is the task at hand today because the view ahead is pretty murky. So let's get to it. All right, we're going to do a deep dive into the data today, but to set things up, I want to play a clip from the man who would be the head of the Fed, Kevin Hasset. Now, I say would because he's actually dropped in the Polymarket odds as the lead candidate to replace Jerome Powell, and two things to note about that. First off, I give you Polymarket odds as a tongue planted firmly in cheek reference because the whole political odds game is disgusting. And second, who would want this job? Working for a president, considering that the DOJ is contemplating bogus criminal charges against the sitting Fed chair. I mean, we are truly living in the worst timeline. Anyway, here's Hasset with a stunning torrent of lies. See if you can pick them out.
Do you consider 4.4% pretty close to full employment at this point?
Right. Well, it's changing for two reasons. It's changing because we've got government employees that have been laid off because President Trump is reducing government spending. That's about 250,000 workers this year. That's a lot. And we also have people who are being deported and re-domiciled because they were here illegally and working. And I think if you add those two things, then a good, healthy labor report is probably closer to 70,000 than 140, 150,000, right, which is what it was back in the day. And so bottom line right now, I'm looking at the output numbers, and we got GDP now north of 5% in the fourth quarter after 4% the previous quarter. So I think you got to say that Trump policies are really working. They're really working, and they're working because they're onshoring production, they're causing factories to build, and in the fullest of time, I expect that to cause a job blowout in the second half of next year, especially.
This goober is such a good professional liar that he deserves the Trump nomination. So let's go through this statement before we look at the actual data from the real world. So the prompt here is whether Hasset considers 4.4% close to full employment. There is no precise statistical measure for full employment from the Federal Reserve standpoint, except as defined as the best labor market relative to its 2% inflation target. This is a very modern construct that's been adopted by central banks that I personally take issue with, but that's for another day. So the real question in this context is this the best that our modern economy is going to be able to produce? So right away, Hasset starts with nonsense answers by running defense for the federal worker layoffs. He claims that this is to reduce federal spending, which is only half true, because the other side of it is that if these workers are now filing for unemployment, that's an expense. Also, if the private sector was so robust, it would be theoretically filling the gap by employing laid-off workers, would it not? Same holds true for the mass deportation of immigrants, which Hasset calls re-domiciling, which is disgusting. Now, this is going to make more sense when we go through the data releases, but let's think through this for a second. If you sent 250,000 federal workers to the unemployment line and the absolute employment level of the country hasn't increased, then it means that there are people not being counted in the unemployment number anymore. These are called discouraged workers, people who want to work but have been out of the game for so long that they're no longer counted. So this is not a flex. The same holds true for the immigrant workforce. If we still have the same number of people looking for work, even after deporting 500,000 people, then it means that the labor market is even softer than reported. But he uses these two examples to suggest that a good report in the Trump economy would be around 70,000 rather than the 140,000 or so back in the day. So to be clear, he's talking about new hires here. This doesn't make any sense. One has nothing to do with the other. The number of job openings in the country is flat at 7.1 million. But there are 6.2 million people counted in the numbers who are actively looking for work, millions more who have dropped out and theoretically still want work but aren't looking for it, and still even more that are working part-time who would like to be full-time. Limiting the workforce by deporting people shouldn't impact the number of absolute new hires unless you're willing to admit that the balance of hires were only filled by immigrants and can only be filled by immigrant labor. Otherwise, it's a stupid metric to settle on. So Hasset's basically saying that we used to do 140 to 250,000, but now under a Trump economy, we can expect 70,000, even though we only did 50,000, and that's probably going to be revised down like every other month in the past. Yay for us. Then he makes a pretty bold claim, saying that we've had 2 quarters of GDP growth over 4%, and the fourth quarter was over 5%. Now, the first quarter of 2025 was negative. The second quarter was under 4%. The third quarter was admittedly 4.3%, but the fourth quarter isn't even out yet. Also, multiple studies have shown that without the stock market growth and CapEx spending on data centers, GDP growth this year is flat and maybe negative. Also, we did a piece on this at the end of the year showing how third quarter GDP growth was the result of increased spending on healthcare, reduction of imports because of prior quarter tariff front-running, higher exports due to dollar deflation, and a massive increase in defense spending. But I love how none of this gets any pushback from these hosts. Then Hasset goes on to say that Trump's policies have led to onshoring and an increase in manufacturing, despite all the evidence pointing to the contrary, as evidenced by the loss of 70,000 manufacturing jobs in 2025. The reason exports have increased is because the US dollar is off 10% from its peak in 2025, not because we're opening new plants and bringing production home. And then he delivers the coup de grace, saying that real job growth is going to happen in the back half of this year. If you go back and listen to every Trump economic advisor from the beginning of this second term, and I don't care which one you choose, it could be Stephen Myron, Peter Navarro, Howard Nutlick, my favorite, Scott Bessent, the worst hedge fund manager in the world turned Treasury Secretary, or this smiling and lying fruitcake, they all say that the back half of last year was going to be gangbusters. This is Trump Economics 101. It's always coming. We're almost there. We'll get them next quarter. Actually, that's a perfect place for us to dig into the data. Let's look at those job openings by taking a look at the JOLTS data from the Beveridge Curve. The Beveridge Curve is one of the most relied upon metrics among labor economists because it measures the level of demand in the labor market. So this chart visualizes the same information in 2 ways. When the blue line is above the red line on the top of the chart, there are more people looking for work than there are jobs. And this is a recessionary trend, and vice versa. Personally, I don't put a lot of stock in the predictive power of the curve because there's a host of other factors that influence recessions and boom times, but it does provide a snapshot of demand. So we can see in the post-pandemic recovery period when demand was higher. Likewise, we can see that figure leveling toward the end of Biden's term and slumping further now under Trump. What I want you to hold in your thoughts is this idea that there are just as many people looking for work as there are jobs available, because it seems like a pretty solvable equation if we had a discernible labor policy, but it's not that simple. So let's take a look at a few of the other data points in the trend lines now that the information is flowing again. Private and public information tell a pretty similar story. Let's start with ADP private payroll. Whenever you're looking at numbers in the vicinity of the pandemic, it's always skewed. But if we look just past the immediate recovery period and in the back half of Biden's term, you can see that the job additions are stabilizing in the 180 to 230,000 range. After inheriting this trend, Trump has managed to reverse it completely to where we lost private jobs in 3 months last year and only reported an anemic gain in December when holiday hiring typically boosts the whole picture. The same thing holds true for BLS figures, which were illustrated really well here by the New York Times. The trend line is simply undeniable. We're not adding jobs in this economy anymore. More than that, take a look at the losses in October. This includes the recent revision, which took losses down 68,000 to negative 173,000. Now, much of this is due to federal job losses and DOGE cuts finally coming off the rolls, but it's an absolutely stunning turn considering no major economist has us in a recession right now. Now, something that I've often disputed, but the point is that this is highly erratic and unusual activity. Now, for the record, November was also revised down by 8,000 jobs. So let's start adding some things up, and then we'll talk about policy and what happens next. So back to where we started the episode. The headline at the end of the year was that the unemployment rate ticked back down to 4.4%, an acceptable level to this administration apparently, but a highly dubious figure when you consider how many job seekers have fallen off, or the level of gig work and the total participation. So dig this. The number of part-time workers increased by 980,000 in 2025. These are people who wanted to be working full-time but listed as part-time workers, increasing by almost 1 million. In fact, as we've said before, in public surveys, if you respond that you were paid for 1 hour of work in the past 4 weeks, you're considered fully employed. Now, the number of people who are not in the workforce but say that they want to be is also up by 684,000 year over year. So I think it's important to drill down like this because the headline noise is such a distraction. And the big takeaway of Trump's first year is that if you have a job, try to keep it. And if you need a job, good luck. And if you really zoom out, that's what you see. Private employment has literally flatlined since Trump took office. So here's a metric with no DOGE cuts or federal workers. The private sector has stalled. And even though the financial news channels greeted last week's initial jobless claims as good news,
initial jobless claims for the week ending December 27th, under 200,000, 199,000.
If you take a long view on the data, there's no material difference in the figures. In fact, 199,000 claims is pretty well on par for the second report in January going back a decade. What's amazing to me is that these financial pundits will celebrate the most marginal drop in something like initial claims while moving the goalpost on new hires, saying things like, well, with our new immigration policy, we just have to adjust expectations on hiring. Were these so-called illegal employees part of the equation or not? Does that really explain away the erosion of new hires when we still have millions of job openings and millions of unemployed people? What about the part-time and gig workers that are growing as a percentage of the total employed population? See, we keep twisting ourselves in knots to make sense of the labor market and what it portends for the overall economy without looking at the nature of employment relative to the whole population. So let's do just that and take a look at the most important chart before we break down the meaning of all of this and what comes next. The participation rate. Now, there are two participation rates. One that matters to economists and policymakers, and the one that really matters. Now, the one that economists and policymakers pay attention to is the prime age participation rate, which is workers between the ages of 25 and 54. The normal participation rate is all workers above the age of 18 who aren't enrolled in the military or higher education. Now, this is something that we've covered before on Meidas, but it bears updating because we can add some flavor to it now. Okay, so the employment rate of workers between 25 and 54 is up around 83%. That's near an all-time high. That's why economists aren't completely freaking out about the monthly numbers. So long as the prime demographic in the US is working, they think that everything is in balance. Now, the blue line, whose percentage is tracked along the left axis, shows that total participation is still down below 63%. Now, on the bottom of the chart, the yellow line measures the total workforce. The red one in the middle is the so-called inactive workforce, and the most useless measure of all, the unemployment rate, is at the bottom. So again, we've covered this before, but it's so important. Only 62% of Americans above the age of 18 and not enrolled in college or the military are considered employed, and the bulk of employment within that sliver are of prime age. So if we include kids under the age of 18 or those enrolled in college or the military, what the data really show is that less than half of the total population has a job of any kind, gig work, full-time work, whatever. And as the population ages, the more economic output is required to care for them. So that's why you see breakdowns like this in private payrolls. We're losing jobs in manufacturing, but we're gaining in areas like healthcare. So you can ignore leisure and hospitality for a couple of reasons. The first is that we have a weak dollar, so it's advantageous to actually travel to the United States right now. Plus, these are December numbers, so there's always a boost. But more importantly, it's a reflection of the fact that the top line of the K-shaped economy is still spending robustly. As for the rest of the economy, not so much. So we know that inflation is stuck around 3% overall, maybe sliding a bit to under 3%, which is still above the Fed target and still on top of years of persistent inflation. And in the basket that matters most to consumers, which is food, it's up way above that. Now, administration officials and pundits will point to how wages of salaried employees increased by a little over 4%, and hourly employees increased by 3.8%. Great. But that doesn't account for the erosion in savings that occurred post-pandemic and for something even more important. Wage increases, Captain Obvious time, only affect less than half of the total population. But price increases impact everyone. Okay, so where does this leave us, and what does the labor market tell us about what comes next? So this is where we can get a little philosophical and air things out. Look at the policies of this administration, to the extent that you can even call them policies. Energy prices are rising, so now Trump is saying that tech companies have to pay for it. Great, right? Credit cards are destroying savings and plunging consumers into unmanageable debt. So he's partnering with Elizabeth Warren, of all people, to propose a cap on interest rates. Great, right? Farmers were crushed by tariffs, so he proposed a bailout for farmers. Great, right? Military spending is historically high, so contractors are making historic profits, but the rank and file can't pay their bills, so he gave military members a stimulus check at the end of the year. Great, right? This is the Trump whack-a-mole seat of the pants strategy, the lottery economy, where hopefully you're lucky enough to be reimbursed for the bad policy decisions that put you in a hole in the first place. These are the actions of a command economy, better known as 20th century style communist central planning. Nothing the administration is doing is working, so they're papering over their mistakes by writing checks or threatening to. In the end, it's a reflection of the fact that we have no industrial labor policy in this country. Tariffs were designed to spur investment into manufacturing, but we lost 70,000 manufacturing jobs. They were supposed to make U.S. agricultural exports more attractive, but our buyers just found different suppliers. Capping credit card interest rates is an admission that unsustainable consumer debt fuels this economy rather than wage gains and true full employment. This isn't about AI. It's not even about immigration. It's not about the federal funds rate or Fed policy at all. It's about the 70-year neoliberal plan to hoard gains at the top of the economic spectrum and to suppress the working class. It's about crushing upward mobility and equal access to prosperity. And Democrats and Republicans, by the way, have been equal co-conspirators in this endeavor until this administration, which is the part that neither side really wants to admit. But now we're dealing with something altogether different. A toxic combination of antipathy toward the working class with the desire to be popular. And in this way, Trump is wholly misaligned with his own administration's policies. See, the architects of Project 2025, in many ways the final chapter of the neoliberal experiment designed to snuff out the aspirations of the American working class, are succeeding beyond anyone's expectations. The labor market that we have now will not and cannot get any better, and the only person in the administration that has yet to wrap his head around this is Donald Trump, because he truly views himself as a benevolent emperor who gives scraps to the peasants and the lumpen proletariat, and he seethes when they are not fully appreciated. And his retribution against the American people has only just begun, because the more he falls out of favor, the more brutal his recrimination will be. The anger of the masses will be matched only by the wrath of this supposed populist dictator who holds them in such disdain. And as we've witnessed on multiple occasions now, His domestic jackboot militia is not only willing to murder our own, but seemingly to do so with impunity and the administration's approval. The despot has the levers of power, and the working class is no longer tied together by like-minded ideology or purpose because it is so far removed from the revolutionary ties that bind. And the labor market that we have is the one that will just be there, eroding steadily with fewer participating in meaningful ways and pressure building on that prime age demographic who exists to support the aging population and the younger generations who now hold no illusions about upward mobility, home ownership, or any of the trappings of the so-called American dream. And if we manage to even have elections in the future, we have a choice to make. Either ride this wave until it crashes to the shore or turn back the tide toward the working class with a large-scale, wartime-like effort to rebuild it. Now, to be clear, Donald Trump didn't create this situation. He's the accelerant. Donald Trump is the arsonist who doesn't even know there's TNT in the building that he's lighting on fire. See, he thinks he's just starting a fire so that he can call the fire department to look like a hero. That's been his entire MO. Start a new problem, look like you're fixing it, claim victory, and move on. But we have structural and systemic issues that have to be addressed. Now, some people believe that this looks like universal basic income. Personally, I've argued for the creation of a civilian labor corps. Either way, we got to have these discussions. It is imperative that the left actively engages in this kind of dialogue and promotes a radical vision to uplift the working class in a non-performative way. Otherwise, we'll just be riding the wave to shore. For the MeidasTouch Network, I'm Max from UNFTR. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to the MeidasTouch if you're not already, and you can follow more of my work on YouTube at UNFTR. You can also sign up for our free weekly newsletter at UNFTR.com. Thanks as always to the Meidas Mighty for having me here, and I'll catch you online.
Want to stay plugged in? Become a subscriber to our Substack at MeidasPlus.com. You'll get daily recaps from Ron Filipkowski, ad-free episodes of our podcast, and more exclusive content only available at MeidasPlus.com.